The epic console wars between Sega and Nintendo were simply amazing, resulting in great experience after experience that I and many others continue to revisit to this day. This grand conflict would serve as a hotbed for both the creation and expansion of some of the most iconic video games that have ever been released. However, what not everyone may remember is that even in the 8-bit era, a fair few Sega games against a lot of odds ended up being produced to run on Nintendo hardware. Last week on this channel, tens of thousands of you seemed to get a kick out of me covering the largely forgotten Altered Beast conversion that was released exclusively in Japan on the Nintendo Famicom. I'll be honest, I believe Altered Beast, regardless of what system it's on, is kind of average, but since you all enjoyed that episode so much, this time I thought I'd turn my attention to a Sega franchise I love. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the weird version of Space Harrier for the NES. Yeah. Don't you just love video games? There's so bloody many of them. It's just a shame though that whether you are buying something modern or something retro, the crazy cost of living has resulted in gaming becoming more expensive than ever before. Fortunately, I have a solution to this problem. Simply use my affiliate link and you'll be able to choose from thousands of modern, retro, AAA and indie titles, many of which are 90% cheaper than elsewhere. So grab some games for next to nothing and expand your digital collection now. Happy shopping! The overlapping 8-bit and 16-bit eras weren't just glorious, they were a revolution in gaming history. This was the golden era, when Sega and Nintendo waged an epic console war for market dominance, pushing the boundaries of creativity and technology to their limits. Gamers were treated to a non-stop barrage of groundbreaking titles that have since become timeless classics, and the fierce competition between these two gaming giants didn't just elevate the quality of games, it ignited a cultural phenomenon, producing iconic franchises, unforgettable characters, and gameplay that still influences the industry today. When it comes to games that pushed the limits of what was possible at the time, no game fits that mold more perfectly than that of Space Harrier. This classic arcade game, developed by Sega and released in 1985, as you can see, was incredibly striking looking and graphically far ahead of most other titles on the market. Space Harrier was designed by Yu Suzuki, one of the most influential game designers of the 1980s and 1990s. Responsible for both Shenmue, Virtua Fighter and so many others, Space Harrier is considered a hallmark of his early career, showcasing his innovative approach to game design and technology. At the time of its release, the game was revolutionary for its fast-paced third-person rail shooter mechanics. In this riveting affair, the player controls a character who flies at high speeds through a variety of surreal landscapes, dodging obstacles and shooting enemies in a 3D-like environment. This blend of shoot-'em-up action with on-rails mechanics created an experience that felt fresh and exciting in the arcades, where most games were of course still using more traditional 2D mechanics. As you can see by looking at its stunning graphics, the game was a huge technical achievement for Sega in 1985, which was in part made possible by taking advantage of the company's superscaler technology. This allowed for fluid and smooth scaling of 2D sprites, giving the impressive illusion of a 3D environment. Space Harrier looks almost unbelievable for a nearly 40-year-old game, and the sense of speed and depth remains a major draw for players to this day. But back in 1985, no one had experienced anything quite like it before. You have to remember, we were only a few years removed from the days that very early simple space shooters filled arcades, and here we had this game that features strange, colourful and dreamlike worlds filled with giant enemies like robots, dragons and alien creatures. A big step up from the simple bleeps and bloops we were used to, with the surreal, otherworldly aesthetic helping set the game apart from what came before it, giving it a unique identity that remains memorable even decades later. Now, what might shock you is that despite this game's huge level of appeal, surprisingly this title was never ported directly to the Sega Mega Drive. Instead, we got a sequel, Space Harrier 2, which functioned as one of the platform's launch titles. Space Harrier 2 was never as popular as the original, as this home console exclusive lacked the arcade hardware's visual and performance impact, making Space Harrier 2 feel like a step down comparatively from its predecessor. To me, this makes it all the crazier that not only does one conversion exist of the arcade original on home platforms, but multiple different ones. Amongst the many versions that were made of the game, Space Harrier showed up on multiple home computer formats, including the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum and more, but unsurprisingly, the majority of these are a bit rubbish. Of course, the game would also be converted to run on 8-bit Nintendo hardware, but only in Japan. As outlined in my Altered Beast episode, as the 16-bit era approached, Sega slowly became more aggressive in positioning their own hardware, especially during the peak of the Genesis era, but before this, by allowing popular Sega games to appear on Nintendo systems, it helped increase their brand awareness and kept their name in the public eye. A lot of these games, including Space Harrier, never left Japan. This was because Nintendo of America had much stricter licensing policies for the NES compared to Nintendo in Japan. Nintendo heavily controlled what games could be published on the NES, requiring third-party publishers to sign exclusive agreements that limited their ability to develop for other consoles, but in Japan, Sega had agreements with specific third-party developers and publishers who handled the Famicom ports of their arcade games. The Famicom version of Space Harrier was released in 1989 and was developed by Takara, a company known for porting Sega games to Nintendo platforms. As a port, it sought to bring the arcade experience to home consoles, but as you can likely predict, achieving such a feat would be rather challenging considering the limitations of Nintendo's humble 8-bit hardware. This would mean that, as you can see, graphically the Famicom version would be faced with significant limitations, which becomes all the more apparent when you remember that the arcade version of Space Harrier used Sega's powerful superscaler technology, the very tech which allowed for smooth scaling of sprites to simulate 3D movement. If Space Harrier 2 didn't look great on the Mega Drive, then what chance did an NES version have? When we account for these extreme limitations, there are aspects of the Famicom version of Space Harrier that managed to impress me. Sure, the Famicom lacked the capabilities of the arcade, and even the Mega Drive, but what was created was a visually decent effort that tried its very best to make the impossible as close to possible as possible. What we would get would be a game that features more pixelated, simpler sprites and choppier pseudo 3D scrolling, with backgrounds and enemies including less detail to ensure that the game runs at its greatest potential. Despite such drawbacks, the developers still managed to keep the game's distinctive, surreal visual style intact, making it very clear that this indeed is a Space Harrier game. Thankfully, despite these limitations, the core gameplay of Space Harrier is faithfully represented in fairly impressive fashion. This means players still control the jetpack-wearing protagonist Harrier, who flies through the game's iconic vibrant surreal landscapes while shooting down enemies and avoiding obstacles. Those familiar with the arcade classic, though, will also notice that the number of enemies and the complexity of the levels has been drastically reduced to cater to the Famicom's limited processing power. Boss battles are present, but the large impressive bosses from the arcade version are scaled down considerably, and from my play experience at least, they tend to feature an irritating amount of slowdown and screen flicker. But what can you expect really with a game this technically demanding on such a rudimentary system? As one would expect, the music and sound effects also underwent significant downgrades. While the arcade version boasted a memorable soundtrack with clear voice samples, the Famicom's audio capabilities resulted in a simpler chiptune version of the soundtrack. The music is recognisable but less dynamic, and the sound effects are more basic, missing the richness of the arcade original. In the arcades, the music composed by Hiroshi Kawaguchi is upbeat, catchy, and perfectly suits the game's fast-paced action. Sure, it does the same job on the Famicom, but the system's more simple sound chip results in more simple sounds. Still, while some might consider this to be a disadvantage, there is still something cool and nostalgic about hearing familiar melodies you know from other hardware being generated by Nintendo's early majestic machines. Sadly, the iconic opening line, "Welcome to the Fantasy Zone, get ready," is missing, because as mentioned, there isn't any speech samples in this version. All the sound and graphical drawbacks, from my perspective at least, just add to the conversion's appeal and charm though, as sometimes I find 8-bit versions of games differ so much from their arcade counterparts that they feel like different experiences, giving you a reason to play them beyond not having access to the original arcade version of the game. You know, the version of a game what was designed to devour all your coins. If I was to hazard a guess, sadly I wouldn't necessarily say that this was an intentional design choice either, but instead a side effect of converting the game that is to be played like this, but on hardware it was never really intended for. What I found is that the slower frame rate and less responsive controls make it more challenging to dodge obstacles and projectiles, with further problems causing Space Harrier for the NES to be even more difficult to play. One thing which was also impressive about the arcade version of the game was of course its super scaling. This meant that in the heat of aerial combat, you could see projectiles coming towards you from a long way away, a privilege players simply don't have when playing the Famicom version of the game. Instead, with less animation frames and less scaling, it feels projectiles appear on screen very quickly, resulting in a much shorter time frame for us to avoid them in. This can be annoying and leads to a much steeper learning curve. That's without even mentioning the fact that using the Famicom's D-pad for movement and the AB button for firing, it isn't quite as precise to play as with an arcade stick. What is interesting is that although all of these shortcomings hinder the gameplay, as far as other 8-bit console versions of the game are concerned, both the Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear ports feature the same limitations as far as scaling are concerned, meaning they contain similar gameplay drawbacks. Still, it's interesting to see Space Harrier running on hardware that is so vastly different and limited compared to the arcade. While we couldn't play Space Harrier on the Sega Mega Drive back in the day, fortunately a high quality version exists on the PC Engine, the system that was localized as the TurboGrafx-16 in America. As far as consoles go, this game developed by Denpa was the finest version of Space Harrier that money could buy for a home console in the 1980s. But if you were really posh and lived in Japan, you might have been fortunate enough to purchase the close to arcade accurate Sharp X68000 version of the game. Also developed by Denpa, this one was available on the powerful home computer a year before the PC Engine version of the game got produced. If you were a Sega fan who logically opted to buy Sega consoles though, a decent version of Space Harrier would finally be made available on the Sega 32X in 1994, before becoming available on the Sega Saturn in 1996. But what's really cool about the Space Harrier story is I think even more people would discover the game in the arcades in the year 2000, and I was fortunate enough to be one of these people. By this point in time, Yu Suzuki's legacy was well established and he had just helped deliver his most ambitious and impressive title ever, the unforgettable Shenmue. Just like Space Harrier before it, Shenmue was a groundbreaking title that revolutionised the industry. Released in 1999, it was one of the first games to offer what felt like a living, breathing world where every NPC had their own schedule, making the player feel like part of a real dynamic environment. Its cinematic approach to narrative, blending martial arts combat, exploration and intricate quick-time events, set the standard for all future open-world epics as we know them. But coolest of all is that Yu Suzuki's masterpiece features an arcade, which we could walk into and visit and experience many of the arcade greats he produced in games within this game. This gameception on the Dreamcast was truly mind-blowing and allowed many gamers to visit an 80s arcade years after that decade had concluded, within an era where the 80s weren't even considered cool yet. This was a time we didn't even have GTA Vice City yet, but Suzuki set his open world game in what is now many people's most nostalgic decade of all. Playing Space Harrier in the arcade within Shenmue was a brilliant and memorable design decision that evoked strong nostalgia in an age where it largely wasn't being catered to much in gaming yet. For some, stepping into an arcade in the game and finding Space Harrier felt like a trip down memory lane, making the experience richer and more meaningful. But for others, such as myself, this was my first Space Harrier rodeo. The inclusion of Space Harrier made the world feel more authentic, like a real 1980s town with an arcade where you could actually play games. This was an awesome meta experience for gamers. Playing an old arcade game within a new game felt novel and fun, with this blending of retro and modern gaming creating an additional special bond between the game and its players. While I didn't get to experience the original Space Harrier in its prime, I loved its inclusion so much in Shenmue that it wouldn't surprise me if I have now spent more time playing Space Harrier within that game than the rest of Shenmue itself. I fell in love with Space Harrier. For this reason, as an adult, I have seeked out and played original cabinets since, including the incredible Motion cabinet, one of which I played with at Fun Spot in New Hampshire. The Space Harrier motion cabinet is a remarkable piece of arcade history, and one of the earliest cabs to offer a motion simulation experience, which significantly enhanced the immersion for players. Designed as a sit-down cockpit with hydraulics that allow it to move in response to your inputs, as you move the joystick, the cabinet tilts and sways, simulating the experience and bringing the incredible world of Space Harrier even more to life. How surreal. While the humble Famicom version we have covered today doesn't deliver the immersion that is even close to what the original was capable of, it is still praised for capturing some of the essence of the arcade and bringing it to an audience who would not have had any access to the game at home without it. Anyway, the fact that it exists gave me the opportunity to gush about Space Harrier, even if the Famicom version isn't close to as good as the original. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget you can get up to 90% off of thousands of modern, retro, indie and AAA titles simply by using my affiliate links in the description. I guarantee you will find loads and loads of bargains. See you all again soon, and cheerio!